Welcome to episode 200 of the MasterYourMix podcast. Woo! And oh shit, we got a new intro too. Welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast. This podcast is for you if you're a musician or audio engineer looking to create pro-level recordings and mixes from your home studio. My name is Mike Indovina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to episode 200 of the MasterYourMix podcast. My name is Mike Indovina, and thank you for joining me. And wow, 200 episodes. This is crazy. Like, I never would have thought when I started this podcast 7 years ago that we would be here today and have 200 episodes or even 10 episodes, to be honest. Like, when I first started, I really had no idea what was going to happen with the podcast. And, you know, it was kind of just something that I thought, oh, maybe I'll connect with other engineers in the Toronto area and just get to know some people better that way. But it's turned into something much bigger than that. And I'm so grateful for all of the amazing guests that we've had throughout the years. And for all of you guys, the amazing listeners, for sticking around, constantly letting me know that you were listening to the podcast, that you enjoyed the episodes, and that you've been finding it helpful. That's really what this is all about. My whole goal with MasterYourMix.com has been to always help out other musicians, to help put out more music. And through this podcast, it's been amazing to hear all of the amazing progress that so many of you have made with your tracks, and to hear all the stories of people finally releasing songs that they've been sitting on forever, or getting played on the radio for the first time, or getting some local press, or getting your first clients. It has been amazing to hear all of the stories that you guys have shared with me over the years, and I'm just so grateful for you to be here. And today's actually a fun day. I'm recording this episode on May 10th, 2024, and today is actually the last day of my 30s. I feel old officially, and I guess it's perfect timing to celebrate the 200th episode of this podcast on the last day of my 30s. And yeah, tomorrow I'm going to be 40. Crazy. But you know what? I'm excited. I'm excited for this next decade of my life. And just when I look back to my 30s and all the amazing stuff that happened in that decade, man, my 40s, they're going to be amazing. And I've got so much great stuff planned for the future. And I can't wait to let you guys in on all of the cool stuff that I'm working on behind the scenes here. And, you know, there's going to be a lot of really helpful stuff coming your way. So super, super excited about that. So with it being the last day of my 30s, episode 200, I wanted to do something special for you guys. And the very first thing is, obviously you just heard, we have a new theme song. To be honest, I have kind of always hated the previous theme song. You know, as someone who mixes a lot of stuff, that was a song that I found 7 years ago from like some stock library, and the mix of it is not that great. There's a lot of harshness in the top end. Anyway, I just felt for an audio podcast, I need to have something that sounds better than that. So hope you enjoy the new podcast theme song. Let me know. Send me emails. Let me know if you love it. Let me know if you hate it. But we're going to stick with it for now. And who knows, maybe we'll change it at some point later down the road. So yeah, we're going to mix it up a little bit here. But also, today we're going to do a different style of episode. We're actually going to kind of throw it back a little bit, to be honest. When I first started the podcast 7 years ago, I honestly did not think that I would be able to get any guests on the podcast. So originally my concept was, why don't we just make a podcast about audio production and answer questions for people? But what happened was eventually some guests actually said they would want to be on the podcast. And then we got more guests, and then more guests, and then bigger guests. And then the cycle just kept going on and on. And since then, I've just been really enjoying chatting with other engineers in the industry, learning more about their processes, and diving into how they think about things and what their mindsets are, what techniques they like to use, all that kind of stuff. It's just been really awesome to connect with other people in the industry and keep this going. So with today, like I said, I want to throw it back a little bit, and today we're going to do a Q&A episode. So if you're part of the MasterYourMix.com mailing list, a little while ago, I put out a feeler saying, hey, look, I'm thinking of doing a Q&A episode for episode 200. And a handful of you guys submitted a bunch of great questions. So today we're going to answer those on this episode. So as I've caught myself saying at the beginning of every episode, which I didn't really mean to do originally, but it's just happened. Hey, I'm accepting it. Anyway, with that said, let's just jump right into it. So the first question comes in from Sam Musa, and he says, what do you think about the sound of the Black Album of Metallica? I want to know your opinion on the production of Bob Rock, the producer of this album. So first off, I think that this record sounds incredible, especially for back in the day when it came out. It kind of set a new bar for what metal could be. And, you know, the drums were massive. Like the snares, they had so much body and weight and sustain to them. The kick drums, They had this clickiness to them, like the punch that cut through all the guitars, and the guitars themselves sounded massive. I feel like it sounded so different than a lot of the other music in that genre at that time. And again, it just showed what could be possible in that genre. And I think that it has largely influenced a lot of the music that we hear today, especially in the modern metal genre. When I listen to people like Nickelback, for example, I know that they're not really considered a metal band by any means, but if you listen to my interview that I did with Chris Baseford on the MasterYourMix podcast, he talked about the idea of making drums that sound cartoony, having almost like CGI kind of drums. And I think that the Black Album was kind of CGI sounding drums for the time that it came out. It was really over the top. It just sounded really massive and larger than life. And again, that's kind of become what we now know today as kind of the standard for the modern metal sound. I think things have evolved. I think that modern metal now sounds much cleaner, much more polished. And I think that that's because technology has enhanced. Things have become more accessible. You don't need to have a massive studio to get big drum sounds anymore. You can do it with samples in your bedroom. All that stuff has made metal so much easier to get bigger and better sounds. Not saying that metal is an easy genre to work in. I think it's actually a very difficult genre to work in. But my point here is that Black Album really inspired a lot of what we know today as the modern metal sound. And I really, really enjoy that record. Now, would I want to make a record today that sounds like the Black Album? Probably not, because I think that album sounds a little dated by today's standards. But nonetheless, it's still an incredible record. And, so tons of great songs on that record. I definitely rocked that album a lot when I was younger. And, continue to listen to it from time to time because it's so solid. So yeah, Bob Rock absolutely crushed the production on that album, and it's definitely become an iconic album that will stand the test of time. All right, so our next question is from Jean-Francois Cote, and he says, when recording guitars for metal and hard rock, how many layers do you usually have? So for me personally, when it comes to recording guitars, especially for like heavier rock or punk or metal, that kind of stuff, I am kind of a fan of less is more, meaning that I don't get crazy into like quad tracking things and stuff like that like some other people do. Instead, I like to keep things simple. So what I like to do is I just take two separate recordings. So I'll get the rhythm guitar player to play it once and then play it again. And I'll pan one take hard left, one take hard right, and I just double track. That's it. I find that when it comes to guitars, a big part of the clarity of guitars is actually hearing the detail, hearing the picking and that kind of stuff. And when you start quad tracking and you add all these different layers upon each other, you start to hear all these little timing differences between all the takes. And to me, that kind of makes things start to sound a little bit murky. And you get all these, like your ear can pick up on these little timing differences that it just kind of makes everything sort of sound flammy and a little bit muddy. So for me, keep it nice and simple. Just a single track on the left, single track on the right. And if you have lead guitars, obviously you record those and have those in there as well. But for rhythm guitars, for rock and metal, double tracking, that's all I ever do. I'm not a big fan of single tracking. It depends on the context of it, but generally when it comes to like rhythm guitars, I'm almost always double tracking just so that I can have that width and go hard left and right and just make things feel bigger. And then by panning things hard left and right and having those two different takes, it does leave some room in the middle for, things like kick, bass, snare, vocals, all that kind of stuff that's important, lead guitars as well. So I just like to keep things off to the side like that. Now, I will say that sometimes, I talked about panning things hard left and hard right. Sometimes what I might do is if I'm trying to go for an effect of a chorus feeling a little bit bigger, I might pan things inward a little bit for a verse, for example. And then when it gets to the chorus, then I might use some automation and pan things hard left and right. So maybe go from like 50% inward to 100% hard left and right. So sometimes that just kind of gives you a little bit more perception of width when it comes to bigger choruses. But yeah, at the end of the day, my rhythm guitars are almost always going to be double tracked, hard left and hard right. All right, so moving on from there, the next question comes from Jean-Francois as well. He's actually got a few of them, so we'll go through each of these. But he says, what is your favorite mic for vocals? The most versatile one that you would bring to your desert island? All right. So for me, the desert island mic of choice would be the Shure SM7B. That's this one I'm talking to you guys on right now. The reason why I like the SM7B is because it just works. It almost always does the job, no matter who I'm recording. It gives you a nice bit of clarity. It gives you a nice bit of warmth. I like that you can hold it if you want. You could also just mount it on a stand. So it's a very versatile mic. Some people don't just want to stand in front of a condenser mic because it can make them feel a little uncomfortable. So giving them something like an SM7 allows them to move around a little bit more and have a little bit more fun with it, and feel the performances too. So, there is a cool advantage to that. But just sonically speaking, I think that the SM7B sounds really great, and it just does the job. Like, it almost always works. Now, that said, if I wanted something that's like maybe a little bit more detailed, like if I was trying to capture something a little bit more intimate, a little bit more breathy and that kind of thing, then maybe like a U87, a Neumann U87 would be a great mic for that. But again, like I just find that, those condenser microphones like the U87s, they can be a little too detailed for my taste, whereas the SM7 just does a great job and just makes everything feel nice and even and smooth, and it just works. So that would definitely be my desert island choice of mic. All right, moving from there, the next question, again, from Jean-Francois, he says, this might be out of scope, so feel free to skip it, but how are you able to write a book with all that you have on your plate? Family, podcasts, students, contract work? Did you create a schedule, protect some time? Did you use any software planning tools to lay out your book? And did you ever think about coaching people to write a book like the one you just did? So, Jean-Francois, great question. So how did I manage to write a book? Well, I got to say, it took time. Writing books took me a long time. Like, both of my books, I'd say, took me about almost 5 years each. And I have to say that I wasn't the best at scheduling time. Like, when it came down to actual writing time, it was certainly not 5 years worth of writing. It could probably be condensed down into a few months. But I was kind of just like, when I first started writing these books, I didn't really know what to expect from them. I kind of just was writing down my ideas, and then I wrote down more ideas. And then I kind of thought, oh, maybe this could be a book. So I kind of compiled things together a little bit more and refined it. And so because of that, I was kind of just writing whenever I was feeling inspired or motivated, which is actually a really horrible way to work when you're actually trying to set out to achieve a goal for yourself. Like, if you are going to make a mission to want to complete a book, like, take time in your schedule, either every day or every week. I have a good friend of mine who writes lots of books, and he puts an hour aside every morning. The very first thing he does is just write. Even if it's crap, he at least got some ideas down, But that was definitely not me. So for me, like, the thing that got me working successfully with it was that I kind of just found my own kind of creative zone of genius time. Like, I don't know how to describe it other than that. It's like the times in the day where I felt like I could just hammer down and write stuff without being distracted. So for me, it was always at night. And when my wife and I had our baby last January, to me, like, it was actually kind of in between feedings that I found I had the most free time to, like, just focus, because I was just waiting around to feed my daughter her bottle. And I was like, I could either just sit down and watch TV, or I could actually do something productive. So I would just, like, write while she was sleeping and just try to brain dump a whole bunch of stuff. So that's not the clearest answer to this question. But I think, if you're someone who is trying to write a book and you're, like, actively trying to achieve, like, you want it to be released by a certain date, then you definitely need to carve out some time to work on your writing and, do your editing and all that kind of stuff there too. Now, as far as the question about, have I ever thought about coaching people on how to write books? It's not something I've ever thought about, but I've now written 2 Amazon #1 selling books. So I guess I have some sort of track record under my belt. So, it's interesting. If any of you guys are ever thinking about writing a book, reach out to me. Maybe if there's enough interest, maybe I could put together something for you guys. But that's kind of my answer there to how I got that. So the last question that comes in from Jean-Francois is, if you had to work in a non-symmetrical room to mix, like the one that he has, how would you reduce the impact of that non-symmetrical room? So in terms of working in a non-symmetrical room, I think that one of the very first things that you need to do is you need to understand what your room sounds like to begin with, right? So what I would recommend you do is get something like, get a software like Room EQ Wizard, which is a free tool, and then buy a measurement microphone and actually run tests on your room to get a sense of what your room actually sounds like right now. Room EQ Wizard is a great tool. Like I said, it's free. And when you use a measurement microphone, it'll tell you exactly what the EQ response is like in your room, the decay time, the reverb time, and it can really reveal a lot about what you're hearing in your room currently. And the reason why I suggest this as your first step is because you need to know what you're actually hearing, right? And how your room is affecting it. So for example, when I moved into my room, I do have a symmetrical room right now, but when I had set up my speakers in the position they were in originally, and I ran my tests through McHugh Wizard, I found that I was hitting nodes where like I was actually losing out at like 80 hertz. I was getting this massive dip where like, just because of the way I positioned things, it was just canceling all out at 80 hertz. And so naturally I would want to boost 80 hertz in my mixes because I wasn't hearing it, right? And once I actually did my measurements and realized what was happening, it then forced me to reposition things in my room and move things around and actually get more control of my room. But it just kind of forced me to think a little differently, right? Because now, once you understand what you're hearing in your room, you won't get fooled by what's actually happening, right? So if you're hearing dips in certain frequencies, you're not going to overcompensate in your mix, and you're not going to boost those things, right? And likewise, if you're hearing boosts, you might not cut too much because maybe that's just how the way your room is responding. So first, understanding your room is the biggest thing you can do. Next, after that, I would say just try to make your room as symmetrical as possible. When it comes to having a nice sounding mixing room, symmetry is definitely a big thing because you want to make sure that you're not hearing reflections off of your right side earlier than your left, because that's going to mess with your stereo perception, right? So try to get as much symmetry as possible, whether that means maybe moving around some furniture, maybe it means just like making sure you're centered in the middle of the wall wherever your speakers are. That's going to be a really big help so that you're not just in a corner and hearing a lot of reflections there. So try as best as you can to get that symmetry. Next, I would say use some acoustic treatment if possible. And the very first thing that I would recommend you do is take care of your first reflection points. So your first reflection points are literally like where the sound bounces off your walls first. And a really easy trick to help find your first reflection points is simply just sit in your chair in between your speakers in listening position, and then get someone to hold a mirror along the wall and just move along the side of the wall. And once you see the center of your cone of your speakers in your mirror, mark that spot on your wall. That's your first reflection point. And by taking care of some of the first reflection points, what that's going to do is essentially help reduce the number of reflections in your room to begin with and mitigate a lot of the stuff that could be causing problems for you to hear. So definitely take care of those first reflection points. That's the very first area that I would tackle with acoustic treatment. And that in itself can help control your sound a lot more, so your room isn't going too crazy on you. Two more options to help with non-symmetrical rooms. One would be just listen at lower levels. A lot of people have the tendency to want to listen at really loud levels. And again, doing that, it's going to cause a lot of energy in your room, and it's going to cause a lot of reflections in your room, and that can really mess with your head. So definitely listening at lower levels can help reduce the excitement in your room, and that might help you monitor a little bit more accurately. And then last but not least, if your room really sucks, listen on headphones. That's the simplest solution there. As soon as you listen on headphones, you've eliminated the room from being a factor, right? Obviously, you're going to want to make sure that you understand your headphones really well, that you know what to expect off of them so that as you're mixing, you can hear things accurately. You might want to lead into some tools like SonarWorks to help you get a flatter response with your headphones. But mixing with headphones might end up being the best solution for you if you really do have a bad, weirdly designed room that, might be sounding kind of crappy and messing with the way you hear things. So certainly don't be afraid to use headphones. And we've had plenty of people on this podcast that have done it as well. I think about the Elaine Rasnick episode that I did. She's a mastering engineer who masters on headphones. So certainly don't be afraid to lean into using headphones as your primary monitoring source if need be. So John Francois, I hope that all helps and that I answered all your questions there and got you what you wanted. So our next question comes in from Tom Krimmer, and he says, I would like to know how you go about gain staging. What is your process? Well, when it comes to gain staging, don't overthink it. That is the first thing. To me, I really don't like to overthink gain staging. I keep it real simple. And the way I do that is that, you want to make sure that you're not recording too loud, that it's distorting, and you want to make sure that you're not going too quiet where you got to then boost it all up and you get a whole bunch of noise. That is gain staging 101, right? But to take it a step further, where I like to set up my levels is in Pro Tools, I usually just go where the green meets the yellow on my meters. That is my sweet spot when it comes to setting my levels when I'm recording. And even when I'm mixing, if someone gives me a bunch of tracks and they're all at different levels, I'll just use clip gain to set them so that where that green meets the yellow on my meters, like if the audio is hitting that, that's good. I don't really get too meticulous with like exact numbers or anything like that. Just that one sweet spot on my meter, which is usually about the 50 to 60% marker on the meter. That's where I'm aiming for my tracks to hit. The reason why I aim for that is just that it's a good level. You don't, like I said, you're not getting distortion, you're not getting a ton of noise. It works really well. And by constantly working at that exact same level, it allows my template to do so much of the heavy lifting. Because in my templates, I've got compressors that react to sounds at a certain volume. And so, when I've got it always hitting at the same volume, the compressor is going to do what I want it to do. It's going to usually reduce it the number of dB that I want it to be. And it's generally just going to react the way I want it. So when it comes to gain staging, Tom, just keep it simple, right? Find your level that is a comfortable level and that is a healthy amount of level where you're not clipping, and just stick to it. And for me, like I said, that green meets the yellow line in Pro Tools, that's my magic sweet spot. I can't remember exactly what the measurement is. I use the Pro Tools Classic meter. I want to say that it's -10 maybe, but honestly, I don't care if it's -14, -18, 10, whatever, it doesn't matter. That's the sweet spot that I hit. So, just be consistent. And the reason why I say consistency is key there is just because, again, your templates are going to do a lot of the work for you, and you're not going to have to really worry about it. So that's the first thing that I do there when it comes to gain staging, is just making sure that all the recordings are hitting properly. Now, I'm not sure if Tom is maybe referring to what do I do when it comes to gain staging my tracks in a mix. Like I said, clip wise, I always make sure my clips are hitting the same thing. But fader wise, my faders aren't just all at zero. There are going to be adjustments with them, and that really comes down to just what's going on in the mix. The more tracks you have in a mix, the louder things are going to get. So you have to maybe pull down some tracks. The more sparse a mix is, the higher your fader position could be, because you got more room to breathe, right? So what I would say is, if you're not sure what kind of balancing to do with your tracks, pull in a reference track and use that to help you get some sense of, what the kick should be like against the bass, or the guitars against the bass, or vocals and that kind of stuff. And that's going to really help you steer you in the right direction with that. All right, moving on from there, I'm going to butcher the name of the person this is from, but I believe it's Mark Felipe Eskenazi. Sorry, Mark, if I butchered your name. Hopefully I got it right. Anyway, Mark's question is, I have a recording question for you about crispness versus dullness at risk of listener fatigue. A recurring problem for me is the overly harsh and crispy frequencies that accumulate in the digital mixing process. It's so easy to keep adding salt. And now these new iPhone speakers are so bright that to have a mix that sounds normal for those casual listeners, but still has a crisp sound on the speakers, is tough. Have you struggled with this? Listener fatigue, harshness, sibilance, etc. A few culprits might also be that it could be my arrangements or the instruments like hi-hat, tambourine, vox, shakers, guitars, etc. Cool. So Mark, great question. So when it comes to creating that overall frequency balance in your mix, the first thing I would say is a lot of modern mixes are brighter. When you compare modern mixes to the mixes from the 80s or 90s or whatever, even some of the early 2000s mixes, I feel like things are getting brighter and brighter. But there's kind of that fine line where you can certainly go too far and get into that crispiness like you're talking about, or dullness. If you don't have enough of that, it might make your track sound really dull and weak. So the easiest solution I have in terms of figuring out how much is enough is to use reference tracks. Kind of like what we talked about with the gain staging and how to know if your levels are kind of matching up well. Use reference tracks to help you as far as frequency response. And the reason I suggest using reference tracks is because you're dealing with songs that have already been mastered and that translate well. So why not use those as your guidelines to point you in the direction of how much you should use as far as top end or low end or mid range. It's all right there for you. So you just need to match up, right? And one thing we have to remind ourselves about is that mixing isn't about making it sound great in your room. And I think that that's a trap that a lot of people fall into. It's so many people, they want it to sound exciting in their room, but the problem is you take your mix outside of your studio and then everything falls apart. So again, reference tracks kind of help calibrate our ears to figure out what it's supposed to sound like in our room when you have a track that translates. And sometimes that might actually mean that your track sounds a little dull in your room, but that's fine, because if that's what it's supposed to sound like, I guarantee you, when you take your song out to another to your phone or to another set of speakers, it's going to translate really well there. So 100% use reference tracks as your guideline. That's going to point you in that direction and really allow you to know when you've gone too far with your low end or mid range or top end, and how much to have or how much to cut, and that kind of stuff. So that's the first thing I would say. And to follow up on that and to kind of piggyback on that a little bit, really take the time to learn your playback devices. So if you're like, make sure you're listening to music on your monitoring system, because so many people just work on their mixing speakers and not enough people actually like take the time to listen to music and get used to what they sound like. When you listen to a lot of music on your speakers, and a lot of music that has been mastered, which let's face it, all commercially released songs have been mastered. But when you listen to more music on your speakers, you start to pick up on how far is too far with your own system. And, you kind of feel when you have too much low end, or you feel when it gets too harsh on your ears, that kind of stuff. So take the time, again, to listen to reference tracks and just get very intimately familiar with those songs and how they sound on your speakers. And then when you're working, bring those songs into your mixes and use those to help you with everything else. Now, Mark also mentioned that maybe arrangement and instrumentation could be a factor in his songs, and that can certainly be a factor as well. Just make sure to prioritize the instruments that are the most important in your tracks, right? Like if the vocal is the most important thing, maybe you don't need your tambourines or shakers to be so bright, because that could be sitting on top of the vocal as well. So it's all about prioritizing and making sure that things have room. And sometimes that also might mean stripping out tracks as well. Maybe you don't need that tambourine. Maybe you don't need that shaker. Maybe the cymbals that you're using, maybe you need darker sounding cymbals when you're recording so that it can make a little bit of a pocket for your vocal. So you have to be factoring in all those things so that everything works together to get you that nice balanced sound. All right, so moving on from there, we have yet another question from Jean-Francois. He's a curious guy. He's got lots of great questions. But he says, hey, Mike, could you mention or link to a Spotify playlist to albums or songs that you've worked on? I'd be interested in hearing those where you've recorded and or mixed, and I think other people would be interested in listening to those as well. So yeah, if you're interested in hearing more of my personal work, make sure to visit my production website. It's MikeIndovina.com. My last name is spelled Indovina. So I've got lots of songs on that site there. You can check out the portfolio that I have on there. A lot of those are actually kind of older mixes, but they'll still give you a good idea of some of the tracks that I've produced, recorded, edited, and mixed, and mastered. So check those out. If you want to hear maybe some more modern stuff that I've recently worked on, an artist that I just worked with that just released a track that you might want to check out is this band called Deeper You. They're an Austrian band. They're kind of like a goth metal band, but they're awesome. Love working with those guys. They're kind of like if Depeche Mode were a bit of a more modern metal band. So check those out. Deeper You. Those guys are awesome. And then if you want to check out some work that I've recently mastered, and they're actually students of mine, a couple of artists to check out. One would be an artist called The Spring Verdict. That's my coaching student, Jeff, who has this awesome indie pop kind of pop rock group. I think you'll really like those tunes too. They're really, really awesome. So the Spring Verdict. Another artist would be Null K, my student Null. So if you look up, his name is spelled Nol, and then the last name is K, or last word is K, letter K. Anyway, so Null K, and he's got lots of great stuff, kind of more of a heavier alternative project. And then another one would be CJ Leonard, and that's my coaching student Chris, and he's got a bunch of kind of tracks that sound like early 90s alternative rock, kind of like REM. So those are all recent projects that I've mastered for my coaching students, and that way you can hear what I can master, but also what my students are up to too, which is pretty cool. All right, so our last question comes in from Florenzi Adana, and hopefully I say his name right. But his question is about reference tracks. He says, most of the time, I don't have a reference tracks for my mixes, and they turn out good. Not sonically good, but good enough for the listeners, which I'm not sure what he means by that. He says, the reason why I rarely have a reference song is because there's a good chance that I could also copy the whole song, and I hate it. It's more like I'm destroying something sacred, and I might just become a musician who copies others' best work. As much as possible, I want my music to sound original and clean. Hence, I stay away from referencing. That said, I've tried referencing, but just for the sound or tone of bass lines. And I've also done referencing after writing or composing the song. Is this okay? If not, how can I get rid of my fear of copying the riff of a song or the melody of the whole chorus and stanza? So, Florenzi, I think that when it comes to reference tracks, there are so many different ways that you can use reference tracks. And you can use references for helping you with the recording side of things, the editing side of things, the mixing side, mastering, or it sounds like in your case, you're talking about using references to help you with the songwriting side of things. And that's totally cool. Now, when it comes to how to use references in each of those stages, let's dive into that a little bit deeper. So when it comes to writing songs, like you can use references to help inspire your decisions in terms of things like arrangement and song structure, like verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. Like you can think about things like that and use those as inspiration. You can even use reference tracks to help you with maybe some cool chord changes, like inspiring, I like when they go from like the 1 to the 5 to the 4 to the 6. Like maybe that's something that you like, right? So like look at those songs and get a sense of, what inspires you about those songs, and you can implement some of that stuff into your songwriting. Now, don't exactly copy it. Obviously, if you're exactly copying things, then it's going to sound like a ripoff, right? So find ways to make variations. So whether that is a variation as far as rhythmic changes, melodic changes, song structure changes, obviously like lyrics, you're not going to rip off lyrics. If you're singing the same lyrics, it's going to be super obvious that you're ripping people off, right? But use those songs in the writing stage to kind of just inspire some decisions, and try to find a way to change it up. Drop certain things out. Don't use the exact same instrumentation. Find cool synth patches that can maybe sound completely different. There's lots of different ways where you can take some structure ideas from another song and turn it into something completely new. So that's how I would use reference songs as far as the songwriting side of things goes. Now, when it comes to the recording side of things, use reference tracks to help you with the tones, like you mentioned. Use references to help you as far as, finding how much attack you need on your snare drum, or how much body you need on it, how much low end is appropriate for your bass or for your guitars, or top end on your vocals, or, you can really use it to help inspire a lot of the tonal differences, tonal changes. It lets you know how much distortion to maybe use, or if you need room sounds, or it might inspire mic position changes, right? Like let's say you want a bit of a brighter sound, but currently your microphone is off to the side of a speaker. That's going to sound usually a little bit darker, right? So if you want a bit of a brighter sound, you can then use your reference track to inspire you and to tell you, hey, we need to make this brighter. And then using your knowledge of how to use microphones, you might want to position that a little bit more in the center of a speaker. And then that would get you a little bit of a brighter sound. So you could certainly use references a lot in the recording stage. Moving on to editing, you can use references to help inspire your editing decisions too, right? If you want your song to sound like something that has been super hyper edited, well, then that song is telling you need to put in the work, you need to edit your stuff a lot and make everything to the grid, right? Or tune your vocals really heavily. And the opposite of that is like if you want a song that sounds a little bit looser, like your reference track, then maybe you don't need to go as extreme when it comes to editing, right? So again, we're using reference tracks to help guide us and give us a process to follow. When it comes to mixing, you can use reference tracks to help you with a bunch of different things. It could be used to help you with the overall levels of your tracks and finding the balance of the kick versus bass versus snare versus guitar versus vocals, all that kind of stuff. You can use references to help you with understanding the stereo placement and getting a sense of where to pan things in your mix. You can use reference tracks to help you with EQ decisions and finding the overall frequency balance of your song or the individual tracks. So, if you listen to your kick drum, for example, you might hear in your reference track that it works really well because the kick drum is really bright and punchy. So then when it comes to EQ, you're going to want to match up that same sort of tone to make it sound right and to make it sound closer to your reference track. So that's definitely how you can use it in an EQ context. Compression-wise, you can also use it as well. So, listen to like, are things pumping? Is there a narrow dynamic range, or are the tracks very dynamic? Because that might tell you how much to compress. Do you want the attack of your drums to be very smooth, or do you want them to be very intense and impactful, right? So again, you can use our reference tracks to help guide some of those decisions and point you in the direction as far as what kind of settings to use there. You can use reference tracks to help you with effects. You can listen to those tracks to get a sense of how much reverb is enough reverb, how much delay should I be using? Is there any cool modulation effects? So there are so many different ways that you can go into using reference tracks to help guide your decisions. Everyone should be using it, in my opinion. And like I'm constantly using reference tracks in my process. When I mix, I think I listen to reference tracks like every 5 minutes or so. It just recalibrates my ears. And like I said earlier to one of the early questions, listening to reference tracks are also going to help you identify what things should sound like in your room. So there are just so many reasons why reference tracks are so important. And inside of my Amplitude coaching program, I actually go really deep into understanding reference tracks and analyzing them, and then taking that information and coming up with your clear game plan and how to actually implement it all. Like I'm a really big believer in reference tracks and their importance. And so I think that people should all be using them as they work, because it's going to help you make better sounding mixes. It's going to help you write better songs. It's going to help you get better source tracks and edit your tracks better. There are just so many benefits to it. So Florency, hopefully that answers your question there. Just don't rip off other songs. That's the gist of it when it comes to using it in a writing stage. But don't be afraid to use reference tracks to help inspire a lot of the other decisions that you have to make throughout the entire process. So give that a shot. And with that, we've reached the end of the questions that you guys submitted. Guys, this was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed answering your questions and getting some insight into what kind of things you guys need help with. And I hope that you found this helpful, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you enjoyed this style of episode, let me know. Send me an email at info@masteryourmix.com. I'd love to know what you think about this style of episode. And if you guys have more questions and you want me to answer them on another podcast, definitely submit them. And I would love to do another episode like this, or maybe we'll make it more of a regular thing. But yeah, let me know if you like this style of episode. And to those who submitted questions for this episode, thank you so much for doing that. Great questions. Like I said, I really enjoyed this. Now, if you're someone who's listening to this and you're thinking, I have so many more questions that I would want to ask Mike, well, in addition to waiting for another podcast episode to come out like this, you might be interested in my Amplitude coaching program, because in that program, I work one-on-one with my students to get them all the answers that they need. And inside of the program, you get one-on-one direct coaching so that anytime you have questions, you can get them answered. And not only questions, but anytime that you're working on something, if you want feedback on your tracks and you're not sure what to do with those songs and, what settings to be using, or, maybe if questions about the production or the different tools or any of that kind of stuff, we work with you inside of that program to help make sure that you get everything you need to get your tracks to the level that you want. Plus, we walk you through our entire step-by-step process for recording, editing, and mixing your music so that there's really no guesswork involved. Instead, you have a clear plan of action to take so that you can get pro results every single time. Now, if you're interested in learning more about this program, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details on that page there. Now, with that said, we've reached the end of episode 200. Guys, thank you so much again for listening to so many of the episodes in the past and for helping me get to episode 200. This is a really awesome accomplishment. I'm super proud, and I can't wait to have another 200 episodes or even more. So thank you once again, and I look forward to chatting with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Take care. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. Please make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave a review. If you have any questions or comments for the podcast, send an email to questions@masteryourmix.com. And for more information on how to create pro recordings from your home studio, visit masteryourmix.com.